Yes, we have a problem that we're living in this obesogenic environment. The food landscape is pitted against us. But I do think that we really have to remember that food is there to be enjoyed. It's so much part of our emotions, our social connections, our culture. This whole idea of negative calories almost sits a bit uncomfortably with me about kind of almost gamifying food.
Hey guys, welcome back to the Digest This podcast. I'm your host, Bethany Cameron, and on today's episode, I have Dr. Sarah Berry with me. She is a professor in the Department of Nutritional Sciences at King's College London and chief scientist at Zoe, and her research focuses on precision nutrition, metabolism, food, and fat structure. So in today's episode, we discuss the food matrix and how the structure of our food actually impacts the way we digest and absorb the nutrients, and how calories actually change in a food depending on their structure. We also talk about negative calories and if they actually exist. We dive into smoothies and the proper way to consume them, and also how fast we eat actually does matter. And if you're peri or postmenopause, Dr. Berry explains the reasons why women experience weight gain even though they haven't changed their eating habits or exercise routine, and why we actually crave more food after a bad night's sleep. So much is covered in today's episode, and I cannot wait for you all to listen in. So without further ado, let's dive right in. Thank you so much, Dr. Sarah Berry, for being on the show today. I feel like it's been a long time coming and we're finally here.
Well, thank you for having me, Bethany.
Okay, so first of all, I like to start my podcast with some rapid fire yes or no questions.
Yeah.
So you can only answer yes or no. You ready?
Yeah, this is what we do on our Zoe podcast. So
I love it.
As scientists, we hate yes or no, but I'm willing to give it a go.
You can't give an explanation, but we can dive in after the fact. Okay, first question. Have we been lied to about how many calories are actually in our food?
No.
Does the structure of our food alter the calories in them?
Yes.
Do we absorb less calories in food that is like harder? Does that make sense?
Yes.
And do negative calories actually exist?
Oh, do what?
Have you heard of that term, negative calories?
No.
Oh, well then we'll have to dive in
You
to
need
that
to educate me.
and see. Okay, we'll go back to that one. And then last question. If we eat slower, do we stay fuller longer?
Yes.
Bone broth has become such a buzzword in the wellness space, but I started drinking it for my gut health long ago before it was a quote trend. I am glad it's gained popularity. However, when something becomes trendy and popular, many companies begin to hop on that bandwagon and produce that desired product, as was the case for bone broth. And now companies are selling it, but sadly, many are either fake or they contain added fillers, natural flavors, and yeast extract, which can be counterproductive when you're trying to heal. So if you want to try real, authentic bone broth for free, that's right, I said for free, all you have to do is give this podcast a 5-star rating and review. And at the end of January, I will be choosing someone to receive a 12-pack of Bonafide Provisions organic free-range chicken bone broth that's frozen fresh, which means they don't use any preservatives to keep it on the shelves, and only, quote, preservative they use is the freezer, which that's how it should be, right? Bonafide Provisions makes their bone broth from free-range chicken bones that are simmered for 18 plus hours and don't use any sugar, gums, natural flavors, or yeast extract commonly found in bone broth sold to the public today. They are certified paleo, keto, gluten, and grain-free, and of course, USDA organic, and packaged in a BPA and EA-free bag. I personally know the owner who lives in San Diego, California, and she is just the kindest, sweetest Christian woman who started this brand out of a desperate need to heal her son from an autoimmune disease. Her and her son's story is truly inspiring, and out of that came bona fide provisions, which you can find in all Sprouts, Whole Foods, and other natural grocers nationwide. You can also order their bone broth directly from their own website with free shipping always included. But I am also offering a 12-pack for free to someone who simply takes 2 seconds to rate and review this podcast. I'll be announcing the winner at the end of this month in an upcoming episode, so be sure to tune in to see if you're the winner. If you suffer with yeast overgrowth or candida, listen up, this is definitely for you. So I recently learned that from a study I read in the NIH, I noticed that magnesium was the key component in helping your body actually get rid of yeast and candida. We can do all of the things by doing a candida cleanse, killing off the current infection and overgrowth, but it still needs to get rid and actually exit your body. And we cannot do that without magnesium. That's right. Without it, your body cannot actually break the yeast down and allow your body to eliminate it. So taking magnesium regularly can help your body detox on so many levels. My husband and I personally take Magnesium Breakthrough from Bioptimizers. Now, the reason I chose Magnesium Breakthrough specifically over all the other brands is that it contains all 7 forms of the different types of magnesium, whereas other brands would only provide 2 to 3 types. So you're not getting the full spectrum benefits. Another thing I appreciate about Magnesium Breakthrough is that it's soy-free, gluten-free, vegan, and the best part is that Bioptimizers has a 365-day money-back guarantee. That's an entire year you can try this product, and if you're not satisfied, you'll get your money back guaranteed. So if you want to get the benefits that a full-spectrum magnesium supplement has to offer, go to bioptimizers.com/digest and use code DIGEST at checkout to save some money. That's bioptimizer.com/digest and use code DIGEST. It is 2025, and in January, I know everyone is on a health kick and looking for better options, looking to revamp their lifestyle, as I feel we all should be all year long. But particularly in January, I know everyone is looking and diving deep into basically all things wellness. And I don't typically say go all in because I think that can be a little bit harsh and you can't really stick to your regimen. However, adding a supplement like beef organs can truly change the game, can lift your mood, can give you more energy, and give you the vitamins that you probably are lacking, as we all probably are. Approximately 92% of Americans are nutrient deficient, and nearly 50% are deficient in vitamin B12 specifically, which can lead to issues like anemia, vascular disease, stroke, autoimmune conditions, fatigue, and even dementia. Thankfully, organ meats are some of the most nutrient-dense foods in the world and can help with these deficiencies. But of course, we all don't want to eat organ meats all the time, and taking a supplement that comes from quality sources is key. That's why I love Equip Foods Organ Complex. This is a blend of grass-fed heart, kidney, and spleen that's dehydrated and put into a capsule form to easily be consumed with any meal or simply a glass of water. Just 3 simple ingredients and absolutely no fillers, no flow agents, and no additional ingredients are added. Equip Foods also has liver capsules if you're particularly interested in upping your iron. Grass-fed organs are rich in vitamin A, B12, coenzyme Q10, heme iron, and selenium. These nutrients provide a multitude of benefits to immunity and vitality. And if you're not sure about them, but kind of want to take the purchase, Equip Foods has a 30-day money-back guarantee. So if you aren't thrilled with your order, just let them know and they'll refund you without any questions asked. You really have nothing to lose and all the health to gain. If you go to equipfoods.com/digest and use code DIGEST, you will get a whopping 20% off your entire order. Again, go to equipfoods.com/digest and use code DIGEST. That's equipfoods.com/digest and use code DIGEST for 20% off. Why don't you introduce yourself and tell my listeners who you are and what you do?
Thanks, Bethany. So I'm a professor of nutritional sciences at King's College London, where I have been an academic researcher for over 20 years, where I have been running lots of clinical trials looking at the health effects of different foods, particularly in relation to cardiometabolic health, so in relation to cardiovascular health and how we metabolize food, with a real focus on food structure, so food matrix, how food structure impacts how we process food, and the health effects of foods. And then in the last 7 years, I've had a dual role where I'm also chief scientist at Zoe, who are a science and health company, where I lead all of the research that we're doing around personalized responses to food, deep dives into a whole load of different areas like menopause, gut health, processed food, and so much more.
Amazing. Yeah. So, because you are so well endowed and you have so much research and education behind you, I really wanted to bring up the topic of food matrix because before even listening to you on previous podcasts, I had no idea what the food matrix even was. So, can you explain that to everyone listening?
Yeah, absolutely. So, in really simple terms, the food matrix refers to the structure of a food. So we know that actually a food is so much more than the simple nutrients that we previously thought about when we thought about the nutritional properties of a food. So traditionally in nutrition research, when we thought about food structure, we thought about it being, we thought about like the health effects of food. We thought about it in terms of protein, fat, fiber, carbohydrate. But we know it's so much more than that. We know it's also about all of the bioactives. So we often talk about things like polyphenols and all the kind of the micronutrients, etc. But what we know is all of these nutrients and all of these micronutrients and all of these thousands of chemicals, on average, an individual food has 72,000 chemicals. All of these chemicals are encapsulated within the structure of a food. And that's what we refer to when we think about food matrix. It's about the structure of the food and the subsequent nutrient interactions that happen within that structure.
Okay. So, can we talk about, like you had mentioned, nuts? So,
Yeah.
how do the different forms of nuts impact the way we digest them? Like whole nuts versus nut butter versus nut milks?
So nuts are a really great example of how the food matrix impacts our health. It's a really great example of how when we think about the health effects of foods, we need to, in my opinion, think of two key things. We need to think about the matrix, so the structure, and we need to think about the composition, i.e. what nutrients are in them. And this is where processing becomes really important. And again, we can use nuts to illustrate this. So one of the reasons that we know processing impacts the health effects of food, because firstly, it can impact the composition of a food, but it can also impact the structure. So if we take nuts as a really simple example to illustrate this, and we can kind of dive as deep as we want to with nuts. So firstly, if we take whole nuts, let's take whole almonds, for example. If we eat whole almond nuts, the back of pack labeling tells us that there's a certain number of calories per nut. So it tells us on average for a 28-gram serving of nuts that actually it's got 168 calories. But what we know is when you eat almond nuts, actually a lot of the calories are excreted, a lot of the fat is excreted. And actually we absorb on average only about 128 calories. So 30% of the calories are actually excreted in nuts. They're excreted because of the matrix of the nuts. So what we know is that when you eat nuts, you swallow nuts when there's a particle size on average about 1 to 2 millimeters. So we do these very glamorous chew and spit studies, as we call them, where we get people to chew the nuts, and the point at which they're about to swallow, they spit them out. It's worse than dealing with poo, dealing with the spit. But and we measure the size of the particles, and they're on average 1 to 2 millimeters. Now, what we know is that actually the particle size of an almond cell within which all of the nutrients are encapsulated is tiny. They're microns. They're so small. They're smaller than a grain of sand. So what that means is at the point at which you're swallowing a nut, in that 1 to 2 millimeter particle, you've got thousands of intact cells. And it's these intact cells, which are like, imagine a ball, for example, that's containing all the fat inside of it. These are intact. The cell walls are very rigid. Cell walls are made of fiber. They're not broken by the process of your teeth breaking them. So you're swallowing these balls and balls and balls of cells containing all the fat that's in almonds and some of the other nutrients. And some of them are digested as they pass through our small intestine.
Yeah, that was my next question is, wouldn't even if you didn't chew them correctly or all the way, wouldn't your body after swallowing digest them and break them down even more? So then you would
So
be consuming more?
yeah, so it depends on the food. So if we take nuts, for example, their cell walls are very rigid. They're quite resistant to digestion. So yes, some of the churning action of the stomach, some of the different enzymes that enter in the stomach break down some of the cell walls. Some of the other enzymes that are in our small intestine also break down some of the cell walls. But we know that actually a large amount of the cells remain intact. We've seen this. We actually collect poo from people. We look at the poo. We look at the particles in the poo, and we see whole chunks of almonds. And you can even see it yourself. So you can go, anyone listening can go and buy some nuts, chew the nuts, have a look in their poo the next day.
Everyone's going to do this now.
I see it in my kids, when when they were of the age when I still had to help wipe their bottom and they were eating nuts. But you can actually see these intact chunks of almonds or walnuts or whatever nut it is coming out the other end where they're intact cells. So yes, some more is absorbed. So what we know is when you chew nuts, you only break up about 10% of the cells. But that doesn't mean that 90% is excreted. What we know is about 30% is excreted. So when you chew them, you break up about 10%. Then you've got about another 60% of the cells that are broken, like you pointed out, through the stomach, through the small intestine, etc. Then they reach the large intestine. Here, some of them are amazing food for our gut microbiomes. They can have a party with these nuts feeding them, which is why nuts are so good for our microbiome as well as our health. But then also some is excreted. So about 30% of the fat is excreted. So that means the back of pack labeling that you get, or front of pack labeling that you get for nuts saying, oh, there's nearly 170 calories in these nuts. Actually, that's a gross overestimation. Now that's for nuts. There's some other types of food that are also impacted by the food matrix where you have everything absorbed, but the rate of absorption is different. And so a great example for this is oats. So I've run clinical trials at King's where we feed people whole large oats, so kind of the really old-fashioned kind of oats that our grandparents would have made porridge with, for example, in previous generations. Or we take those oats and you finely grind them, and you feed on one day the whole large oats to individuals, on the next day you feed the finely ground oats. Back of pack labelling is the same because it's the same ingredient. It's exactly the same oats. All that's different is the particle size. All that's different is the matrix, the structure of the food. Now, what happens is you actually absorb everything because the cell walls in oats aren't as rigid as nuts. So they aren't resistant to digestion, but you totally change the dynamics of absorption, meaning you totally change the rate at which they're absorbed, which means that the finely ground oats cause a really big increase in circulating blood glucose. Then you had a big dip after. Yet the large rolled oats cause a very slow increase in circulating blood sugar. They cause a very slow decline. They keep you fuller for longer. They release more of the hormones that are related to fullness. So they're absorbed lower down your gastrointestinal tract, which has more receptors related to fullness. So you'll feel full for longer. You'll have a more balanced blood sugar response. And the oats and the almonds are two great examples of how important matrix is. And we can dive even deeper into almonds, for example, if we think about, well, what about if we process the almonds?
Right. I was thinking
So
like
what
nut
about
butter and it's now
exactly.
smooth or the milks. Yeah.
Yeah. So what about if we take some almond nuts? And our research has shown if you just eat whole almonds, you chew them normally, they come out, 30% of the energy comes out in the poop. Well, what if we grind them? Does that make a difference? And what we know is if we really, really, really finely grind them, and I mean using processes that you would not be able to do in your home kitchen, but where you're actually fracturing all of the cells to release all of the lipid, what we know is that if you really finely grind them, then you do actually release all the lipid. So you do have 100% absorption. And we've done studies at King's where we fed really finely ground almonds, and we know that this elicits a similar response to if you were to kind of actually, extract the almond oil and just feed the almond oil with the flour. However, the kind of processes that are typically used to create almond butter don't actually grind it that fine. So you've still got a large proportion of the nut cells intact. So you still, although you won't see them in your poo in the way that if you're choosing, eating whole almonds or whole cashews or whole walnuts, but actually you've still got quite a lot intact. And so it will depend on the nut butters that you're buying, just how smooth they are. But even most smooth butters, even if they are made using industrial grinding, a lot of the time they're still not finely enough ground to break all of the cells.
Oh, so interesting. Yeah. Well, this brings up a couple topics. One, when I was really really ill and I really couldn't digest anything, I worked with a holistic doctor. This a lot of my followers know my background story, but I was literally skin and bones, couldn't digest anything. I had a bunch of gut issues happening. Anyways, long story short, my holistic doctor told me to puree all my food to help me absorb more of the nutrients because it was either that or a feeding tube, basically. And so I had to puree my meat to like a applesauce yogurt consistency. I mean, that's how severe this was. So I would puree all my food, including my meat. And
Yep.
he said I would be able to absorb it better and more efficiently, and my body wouldn't have to work as hard to break it down. So this just really makes sense as far as the food structure. And would you say this goes for smoothies as well?
Yeah, so I think just to pick up on your first point, it's a double-edged sword where we're around the matrix, and I think this is important to pick up on because often we talk about foods being in their whole original matrix, like the nuts, consuming them as nuts rather than finely ground as being advantageous. That's advantageous in the obesogenic environment we live in. That's advantageous for people who are over consuming energy. But we do need to recognize that is not the same for everyone. So in your situation, you would want to be grinding that for exactly the reasons you said. And also what we have to remember as well is that we might also be losing some of the other nutritional properties. So for again, we've done studies feeding the whole almonds or very finely ground almonds, and we've been looking at some of the micronutrients that we know are really rich in almonds, such as vitamin E. We know that vitamin E is in high amounts in almond nuts. And if you eat whole almonds, you don't absorb as much vitamin E because, again, it's encapsulated within the cell walls. It's where the fat is because it's a fat soluble vitamin and it's excreted out. You'll absorb some, but not all of it. But if you finely grind them, not only are you accessing all of the calories, which again, depending on whether you want more calories or less
Right.
calories, it is different, but you'll access all the micronutrients, you'll access the vitamin E and the other beneficial components. And so this is where I think it's interesting, then going on to your second point around smoothies. And there was some work done some time ago, in 1977. There's this wonderful study that was conducted by a scientist called Haber. And this was published in The Lancet. And this is the first time anyone ever really thought about food structure in the way that we now talk about food structure. And it's a really important study because I think it's so relevant as well to how our food landscape is now with all of these heavily processed, ultra processed foods. And he did a study where he fed individuals either whole apples, he fed individuals apple puree. So he literally took the same amount of apple and just pureed it. So it was exactly the same ingredients. And then on another day, he fed individuals the apple juice. So this is the juice of the apple, but without the fiber.
Right.
And what he found was a couple of different things. Firstly, he found that when people ate the whole apples, on average, to eat a certain amount of apples containing a certain amount of calories, it took about 15 minutes. To eat the equivalent amount of puree from that apple, so exactly the same calories, it took about 5 minutes, so a third of the time. To eat the apple juice, again containing the same amount of calories, but this time without the fiber, it took about 1.5 to 2 minutes. What he found as well is even when people ate exactly the same amount of calories, but depending on whether it was apples, the puree, or the juice, the apples kept people fuller for longer. The apples meant people were fuller after 30 minutes, but they stayed fuller for longer. The puree was kind of intermediate. So because it was in that soft form, they stayed less full, and the apple juice, they hardly stayed full at all.
That makes sense regarding the juice because there's no fiber. But in regards, you said it's all the same amount of calories. And so in my mind, I'm thinking, well, it took people the longest to eat the apple. And correct me if I'm wrong, but the longer it takes to eat something, then your mind and your gut, those signals are like, oh, I'm full. But if you scarf something down really quickly, that signal isn't there yet.
Absolutely. So people were told to eat a set amount. So they didn't stop eating because they were feeling full, but they recorded their levels of fullness. And it's in it. One of the key mechanisms here is the fullness response. So they've got time for the fullness signals. We know it takes beyond 10 minutes for our food to get to where our fullness signals are. There's all different ways that our body tells us are full. We have stretch receptors in our stomach that feed back to our brain. We have receptors in our intestine that become more and more concentrated as you go down the small intestine. And these receptors send signals back to our brain to say that we're full. What we know is if we're eating apples more slowly, it's giving us more time for the fullness signals to come back. But also what we do believe, and this is what we're inferring from our own research that we did with the oats, for example, is that when it's in a more whole form, it's absorbed lower down the gastrointestinal tract where you have more of these fullness receptors. So it's telling you you're more full, yet the liquid or the soft food is absorbed higher up. We also know, though, there's something else really interesting happening, and this ties in really nicely with some of our work, that as well as the rate at which we're eating impacting our feeling of fullness, it impacts our post-meal glucose response. So our blood sugar response, having had those different, whether it's the smoothie or the whole fruit. And what we know is that it impacts what we call the dip. So about 2 to 4 hours after you have any kind of meal, some people have a dip in their glucose that goes below their fasting level. So what happens is when you can eat a meal that contains carbohydrates, so fruit, for example, you have an increase in circulating blood glucose that peaks around 15 to 30 minutes, returns to baseline around 1 to 2 hours. So normal physiological response to eating anything containing carbohydrates. What we see, though, is that some foods cause people to have a dip below the baseline about 1 to 2 hours after they've had that meal. And what Haber saw back in this 1977 study is when people were having the juice, they had a really big dip below baseline. When they had the puree, they had a moderate dip, but when they had the apples, they had no dip. And this is interesting because our own Zoe Predict research has showed that if you have a dip 2 to 4 hours after you have any kind of meal containing carbohydrates, you have an increase in hunger. We've shown from our own research, people that have a dip after their food go on to eat 80 calories more at their next meal, and over a whole day will eat 300 calories more. And so that's what I think is really interesting around the matrix, is impacting from the nuts, how much we're absorbing depending on the food. It's impacting, if we think about the oats, the rates of absorption, our feeling of fullness and hunger. And then if we apply it to how we might eat fruit as a puree or, as a smoothie or as a whole food, it's impacting the rates of absorption, it's impacting how quickly we're eating it, it's impacting our feeling of fullness, and it's impacting those dips that mean that we might go on to eat more at our next meal. We might feel more hungry, we might have less energy, we might feel less alert. Now, that's not to say that pureed fruit is bad for us. If it's certainly better than no fruit, if my children will eat pureed fruit or fruit smoothies, they can have that every day.
It is January 2025, and for most, that means cleaning up your diet from all the holiday food, setting new goals, and sadly, for many, getting sick. That's right, it's sick season, and for some reason, it hits hard during this time. So, to be equipped and prepared to fight off all the bugs roaming around, one easy shift I and you can make in your daily routine is taking a quality vitamin C. I have tried many vitamin C brands on the market, and I'm not going to say they don't work. However, I have noticed from personal experience that my body absorbs more of the active components when it's in a liquid form rather than a pill form. I think my body just breaks it down and absorbs it more efficiently when it's in a liposomal vitamin C. That's why I'm so excited to share about Peak Tea's liposomal vitamin C. Peak Tea's liposomal vitamin C is not only packed with 1,000 milligrams of vitamin C, but also organic elderberry, which we all know contains an immune boosting compound. In fact, a study in the NIH reported that supplementing with elderberry reduced cold duration and symptoms in air travelers. But that is not all, you guys. Another study in the NIH discovered that combining vitamin C and elderberry together improved the nutritional value of the elderberry and increased protection against oxidative degradation. Peak Tea's Daily Radiance Immune Support is so easy to add to your daily routine. You can place the pouch directly in your mouth because it actually tastes really good, or you can add it to a smoothie, a yogurt bowl, drizzle on top of toast. I personally love taking it straight in my mouth. These individual packs are also easy to travel with, and that's even more reason to take them because traveling can cause your immune system to be super compromised. So, whether you're a stay at home mom in contact with kids all day, a businesswoman interacting with multiple people, a gym junkie using sweaty machines, or a college student just trying to get through the semester without getting sick, Peak Tea's Daily Radiance Immune Support liposomal is perfect for everyone. Peak has a free 30-day return policy. So if you try something and you're not happy with it, just send it back for a refund. And you guys know I got a deal for you as well. If you go to peaklife.com/digest, you can receive up to 15% off plus up to 2 free gifts. That's peakuelif.com/digest to get a discount and some freebies. I'll leave that link in today's show notes for an easy tap. Nobody likes to talk about poop, constipation, or even diarrhea, but it's pretty common over on my Instagram and on this podcast. So I'm not really shy to talk about these things because we all do it and we all have experienced it or maybe going through it right now. And if you feel you have poor gut health and your immunity is suppressed, there's actually a huge link. Poor gut health has not only been linked to poor immunity, but also depression, anxiety, brain fog, low energy, skin issues, including acne, and studies are now coming out that our gut microbiome is linked to obesity and type 2 diabetes. I feel like I talk about gut health way too much, but at the same time, not enough. And I definitely feel like I don't talk about Seed enough. And Seed is a partner of mine that I started taking their probiotics, maybe over 2 years ago now. It's their DS-01 Symbiotic Capsule, which is a pre and probiotic all in one. And there's no refrigeration needed, so you can take it on the go, you can travel with it, and you don't have to think about where you need to store it. I mean, if you really think about it, if you are taking a refrigerated probiotic capsule, How is that going to survive your 98.6 body temperature once it gets down in there, right? So you have to really look and see how are these probiotics going to survive. So you definitely want a soil-based probiotic, and that is exactly what seed is. So I highly recommend you giving them a shot. If you're one of the millions that have been on the fence about seed and have been curious, now is the time because my listeners get 25% off their first month, and you can cancel anytime, even right after if you want to. Just go to seed.com/digest and use code 25digest to get 25% off your first month. That's 25% off your first month of Seed's DS-01 Daily Symbiotic at seed.com/digest and use code 25digest. Well, and it's interesting because, I have a lot of followers too, and they tell me, oh, because I love smoothies. I make smoothies and it's, not juice. It's the whole food just broken down with some protein powder and such. But it takes me, I don't know if my followers know this, it takes me about an hour to eat a smoothie because I make it really thick. It's not something I drink through a straw. And so I will eat a smoothie and it'll take me an hour to eat that. And I'll do stuff on the computer, do emails or whatever. So I'm like slowly eating this, but I think, and I feel full afterwards versus scarfing it down within 10 minutes. And I think a lot of people tend to do that with smoothies.
Yeah.
And then they complain about being bloated. Well, I'm like, okay, would you have eaten all the food that was pureed in 10 minutes? Like if it wasn't pureed, does that make sense? And they're like, well, no, I wouldn't. So it makes sense that you're feeling bloated because you literally just scarfed down all this food that was pureed down.
And I think, Bethany, that what you've said here is a really good way that actually we can advise people is it's taking you probably the amount of time if you were to have them all as the separate components, okay, or maybe a little bit longer, but if you were having it as the whole fruit, the whole protein, the whole whatever. And I think maybe what we can recommend to people is you don't need to avoid smoothies, but eat them in the way that you're saying. So just slow it down. Think, okay, here I've got, 4 pieces of fruit. Try and add obviously some fat and protein is an ideal situation. Like you've said, you add. But as well as adding that fat and protein, think, well, how long would it take me to eat these if they weren't as a smoothie? And then try and mimic that same amount of time. I think that's a really good practical tip for people who do like smoothies.
Yeah, that's a great tip. You did mention too regarding the volume because the receptors in your stomach, how you said, oh, well, if you can have a lot, let's just say someone can eat 2 apples and feel super full because of the volume. But there's also the whole satiety in the fat factor because some people need the fat to feel satisfied. Like I'll take myself, for example. I can eat a 0 fat meal or something. There's no fat in it. But then I'm like, I'm still hungry because I didn't have the fat for the satiety. However, on the other hand, if I just eat, I don't know, this is a stupid example, but if I just eat like a couple tablespoons of olive oil, it's a lot of fat. But it's so small, it's not filling me up volume-wise. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so we know that fat and protein are more satiating, so they make us feel more full, and that's because they stimulate the fullness receptors more so than carbohydrates do. So we know that adding fat, adding protein to our meal has many advantages in terms of firstly slowing down the rates of gastric emptying. So it slows down the rate at which your stomach empties, so you have a slower release of nutrients, which is going to make you feel fuller for longer. But it also stimulates those fullness receptors. So it feeds back to your brain that you're getting full. And so it goes back, Bethany, to that quite boring message that, nutritional scientists like I say all the time, it's about balance. It's about, having a bit of protein, having a bit of healthy fats, having your carbohydrates, mix it all up. So if you are having a smoothie, for example, slow it down, the pace at which you're eating it, but make sure you're also getting some protein in there, whether it's through yogurt or however you like to add protein. Make sure you're getting some healthy oils. So, for example, yes, don't go and just have 2 tablespoons of olive oil because, well, firstly, I don't think it's going to taste very nice, but it's
You probably
going
won't be
to
satiated.
not be satiated, but you could, if you like the flavor, add it to your smoothie. So, yeah, it just goes back to that whole having a bit of balance with every meal.
Yeah, for sure. Now, at the beginning of the episode, I did mention negative calories, and I think
Yeah.
so. Basically, the concept is a negative calorie is a food that takes your body more energy to digest than the food contains. Let's just say I'm going to take celery, for example. So it's been said that celery is a negative calorie because don't quote me on this, but let's just say like a stalk of celery is 5 calories, but your body takes 10 calories of energy to break it down and digest it. So it's actually a negative calorie. Does that make
Yeah.
sense? Now, is this true? Is this like actually exist?
Well, firstly, I've never heard of it. So thank you for educating me. Um, do you know, I would need to go and look at individual foods. Yes, every time we eat a food, we do use some energy to burn it. We know there's a thermogenic effect of eating food. We know that protein uses more energy to, digest and absorb, for example, than some other nutrients, which is why some people really focus on protein, for example, if they're in weight loss, as well as the fact it keeps us full for longer. We know that fiber is largely undigestible depending on the type of fiber. Some fiber we don't digest at all, and is totally insoluble, and so therefore we're not getting any calories. So theoretically, I guess that you could have negative foods if it was just fiber, maybe with a bit of water. I'm thinking aloud here.
Right. Well, and I'm even
But God, I
thinking,
don't know. I'd love to see what the list of foods are, and I would love to actually go and look at what their calorie content is, what their nutrients are, and actually do the maths, so to say. I
yeah,
mean,
Google
yeah,
negative calories, and I'd be curious to pick your brain afterwards and get your thoughts because you're an amazing smart woman. So we'll have to table back to that one because I love your opinion on
yeah.
it.
I mean, I do think as well, Bethany, that yes, we have a problem that we're living in this obesogenic environment. The food landscape is pitted against us. We have all of these readily digestible foods. We have all of these foods where the matrix is destroyed. We have these kind of foods that are mucking up with our hunger and fullness signals, etc., etc. But I do think that we really have to remember that food is there to be enjoyed. It's so much part of our emotions, our social connections, our culture. And so this whole idea of negative calories almost sits a bit uncomfortably with me about kind of almost gamifying food. Oh, can I eat something that isn't really going to add any calories to my diet? Well, we need calories. And yes, we need to not eat them to excess. And if we choose whole foods, choose unprocessed foods, then we're going to be in a good place. And I think to start obsessing about, oh, this food is a negative, is it a negative food? Is that what you
A
called it?
negative calorie, yeah.
Okay, so like a negative
Uh-huh.
calorie food. I worry about kind of just over focusing on the wrong thing about a food. What we should be focusing on is how nutritious is it, how much fiber is in it, what kind of diversity are we getting from our food, etc. But that's more my perspective on eating.
Yeah, well, and I think a lot of people do tend to focus more on the macro than the micro. And we forget
Yeah.
about all the nutrients and vitamins and minerals that we could be missing out on. Now, you did mention ultra processed food, and I kind of want to dip into that because is it true that ultra processed food versus food made at home, even though it's technically the same thing, do we process them differently like potato chips, for example? Let's say we make potato chips at home and then we also buy potato chips at the store. How is that still different?
So, what I would love to do is run you through what I think the main reasons of why ultra processed food are different or how they're different to unprocessed foods. And then I think if we look at it from that perspective, then I think it's easy to make a call.
Go for it.
So I think what we need to think of, well, what does processing impact? Well, firstly, it impacts the matrix, which we've talked about. And we know that the matrix goes on to impact eating rate, how much energy is available, our gut hormone release and hunger. So we know it impacts the matrix. And that's more to do with the physical disruption that processing does. So, using your example of homemade chips versus shop bought chips, I don't think it's really going to have a big impact on the matrix, but that's one way it impacts it. The other way processing impacts our food is it affects the energy density. In general, lots of processed food is more energy dense. So, in general, there are more calories per gram or per milliliter or per liter of that food if it is heavily processed than if it is unprocessed. The other way that processing impacts our food is the nutritional composition. There tends to be an increase in unhealthy nutrients. There tends to be higher salt, higher sugar. There tends to be a decrease in healthy nutrients. There tends to be lower fiber. There tends to be a reduction in what we call bioactives. So a loss of these wonderful other nutrients that you alluded to a minute ago. So things like polyphenols that have far-reaching health benefits. And then there's also the addition of unhealthy nutrients. So certain additives, certain emulsifiers, we know impact also the helpfulness of the food. And then the fourth reason that processing, I think, impacts the helpfulness of that food is the impact that it has on palatability. So often processing changes the texture of the food, so it's more palatable, so you're eating it more quickly. It also often changes the ratios of salt, sugar, and fat in the food so that it reaches this kind of bliss point in the brain that leaves you craving more. It hits all that kind of dopamine areas saying, oh, I want more, so you have an increased energy intake. So when we think about how ultra-processed food or processing impacts how that food impacts our health, we need to think, well, how is it nutritionally different in terms of the composition? Does it have additives? Does it have less healthy nutrients? Does it have more unhealthy nutrients? Does it impact the energy density? So we're overeating it. Does it impact the palatability? So again, we're eating it too quickly and overeating it. And fourthly, does it impact the food matrix, the structure, for all the reasons we've just said? And then if we're armed with kind of that knowledge of those four key factors, I think we can make quite good informed decisions as to whether this food, just because it's bought in a shop and is in some plastic wrapping, is actually that much worse for us than if we make it at home. So if we take potato chips, for example, or if we take fries, for example, if we were to make fries at home, so dicing the potatoes, putting them in oil, I actually don't think that they would be particularly different to most of the shop bought ones, depending on the oil that they're fried in. But most shop bought ones, certainly in the UK, are using a mixture of oils that you might use in home frying. I mean, I know not many people home fry fries anymore. And so then you're not getting a huge difference. But then you can take other foods where you then see a massive difference depending on whether you're making them at home or depending whether they're in the shop. And that might be because they're using processors that you wouldn't be able to use at home, that's changing the structure in a way that you might not, using a typical blender or a typical cooking process, be able to change. They might be adding in additives in order to preserve the food so it's got longer shelf life. If you bake a loaf of bread at home, 2 days later it's quite hard, isn't it? You buy the bread in the supermarket, the kind of sliced bread, that can last like a week and a half, and it's still soft because of all the things that are put in to improve the shelf life. Now, this is really important when we have a growing population. We need to make sure our food is safe, i.e. that it's not going off. We need to make sure that it's affordable. So again, it's that double-edged sword as well.
Well, and I see this too, just to piggyback off of your examples, is that if you make something at home, you are chopping it. Let's just take like a vegetable soup, for example. You're chopping it, you're chopping the vegetables so they're freshly chopped. The nutrients are more readily available versus even not canned, but like let's just say you went to a soup shop and they're serving some soup fresh, it could have been made the day before, 2 days before. So like when you're making it at home, it is the freshest as possible. And the nutrients will degrade even in your own home after a time in the fridge. So yeah, to that point. Now, I do want to talk a little bit about protein for a second. Now, is there a cap of protein we can only consume in a day?
So protein is one area that I've not actually researched in my career.
Okay.
So I've done a lot of research around fat, a lot of research around carbohydrates. Um, I have a general perspective on protein that I think that in general we're over focusing on it at the moment. I was recently in the US and I went to a lunch, I don't know what you call them, like a kind of sandwich shop style thing, or,
Yeah.
one of these lunch kind of delis. And it was totally different to what we have in the UK, in that there was the sides, i.e., the vegetables or salads, and then there was a section that actually said protein. And it either had your chicken or your tofu,
Roast
or
beef or
another
whatever.
sort of,
Yeah.
yeah. And it was called protein. And I know in the US for a while there's been quite a focus on protein, that there hasn't been so much here in the UK.
Yeah. It's pretty
In
big
general,
here. So that's why I'm asking.
yeah. So in general, in the UK and the US, most of us are getting enough protein. So very few of us are not getting enough protein to live a healthy, happy, normal life. Now, obviously, it does differ our needs at different ages. As you get older, you need slightly more because you process it less well. If you're more active, then yes, you might need more. There's slight differences between males or females. I think that we need to be mindful that everyone's needs will differ depending on their own circumstances. There's also some fascinating data coming out of our research group at King's College London, where they've looked at how different people metabolize protein differently, i.e., some people are kind of super absorbers and some people are quite poor absorbers. So I think that it's very difficult because you wouldn't know whether you're a super absorber or a poor absorber. But
Are there
even that
tests?
is fascinating. That not yet. I mean, this is a whole new area of research. This is data that was only just presented at a conference a matter of months ago, showing actually how people process it, how much they absorb, how it affects their protein stores is very different from one person to the next. So I think that yes, if you're a poor absorber, and yes, we don't know yet a way to assess that at an individual level beyond kind of the clinical research level, then maybe those people do need to be having more. Now, that's not terribly helpful because there isn't a test that we can do to check whether someone's a better absorber or not. But I do think the totality of the evidence would show that in general, we are, as a population, getting enough protein. And what I find really interesting is from my own research studies where we try and manipulate people's diets. So we're often trying to get them to change their diet from this type of fat to that type of fat, or to add more fiber in, or, etc. What we can do is we can always bring about lots of changes in all of their other nutrients, but what stays quite consistent always is the amount of protein that people are getting in their diet. It's always around 18% of their energy coming from protein. That it's actually quite hard to shift the amount of protein you're having if you're just consuming kind of a normal balanced diet without really focusing on it. And other researchers have found this. One of our collaborators, Christopher Gardner, who's a professor of nutrition at Stanford University, sees exactly the same. He's always like, whatever study I do, however I change someone's diet, their protein intake tends to always stick around that kind of 18%. I haven't really answered your question
No,
about whether there's an upper cap, but
no. That I think you gave us a lot of good information, but I do know that you are pretty well endowed in the menopause era, and I want to quickly just dive in, if you don't mind, with the time that we have.
absolutely.
And is there any kind of we talked a lot about food matrix. Is there any kind of connection between menopause and the whole way of maybe when you're going through it, should we be changing the food structure to help that transition?
So I think when we think about menopause and health, we need to break it up into two broad areas. We need to think about menopause and symptoms, which I think everyone's talking about at the moment. Go onto social media, or maybe the people I follow, we're doing lots of research at Zoe on this as well, about how burdensome symptoms are, what can we do to minimize symptoms. We see from our own Zoe research, 99% of people have one symptom, 90% of people to have 10 or more symptoms. You have the symptom side, and by symptoms, I mean things like brain fog, irritability, memory loss, hot flashes, etc., etc. But then you have another core area, and I think this is where food becomes particularly important. This other area is related to health and disease. So, what we don't talk about often when we talk about menopause is actually when you become peri or postmenopausal, then your risk of disease changes dramatically, and how you process food also changes. So, just a really quick, for those that aren't familiar with menopause research, just a really quick whistle stop tour of what menopause is. So menopause basically refers to the point in time 1 year after your last period, so after your last menstrual cycle. So it's your pausing of menstruation, hence menopause. But you don't go to bed one night premenopausal and wake up the next day and, hey, I'm postmenopausal, that's it. There's a whole perimenopausal transition, which is when your estrogen starts to decline as you're starting to lose eggs, etc., etc. And again, this doesn't also happen in a beautiful, slow, gradual decline. It's like a roller coaster. Your estrogen's kind of pinging all over the place. Some days it's really low, some days it's back up. Hence why symptoms are so variable day by day, hour by hour, because your estrogen's kind of on this sort of roller coaster. That perimenopausal phase can last anywhere from a couple of years up to 10 years. But once you become perimenopause and you start losing estrogen, you start having health effects and you start changing the way you process food. And this is because nearly every cell in our body has estrogen receptors. Hence why the symptoms are so far reaching, like the brain effects, i.e. memory loss, etc., but it also impacts our health. So what we see is up until the point of menopause, men tend to be faring worse than women in terms of lots of health measures. Men tend to, at a given age, have higher blood pressure, higher body fat around the belly, higher blood cholesterol, worse insulin, worse glucose control. As soon as you reach the perimenopausal phase, i.e. when the women's estrogen is declining, suddenly women start to catch up with men and in some cases overtake. So once women become peri and postmenopausal, suddenly their cholesterol increases, their blood pressure increases, and in our research to an even higher level than men. Their adiposity, so the fat around their belly increases, etc., etc. And this is because of the central role that estrogen has in the functioning of our cells. What we've also seen from our own research is that it also changes how we metabolize food. So what we've seen is that peri and postmenopausal women have a more unfavorable metabolic response to foods compared to premenopausal. And what I mean by this is if we give someone, as we did in our Zoe Predict research, a mixed fat and carbohydrate meal, and we look at how postmenopausal and perimenopausal women respond to it versus premenopausal, they have a higher blood sugar response, they have a higher blood fat response, they have a higher inflammatory response in the 6 hours after eating that meal compared to their premenopausal counterparts. Now, one of the challenges with any menopausal research is menopause is an age-related event. And so the question then people will say, well, of course it's going to be different as you get older, your metabolism changes. But because we had such a large cohort in our Predict studies, we were actually able to age match individuals. So we took people who were of a similar age, who were either peri and post or premenopausal, but they were similar age. And what we found was that even when you age matched, they had a more exaggerated response. So they had a higher blood sugar response to a carbohydrate compared to if they were premenopausal, which means that they might want to be more cautious with the amount of carbohydrate and the matrix in which they're having the carbohydrate.
Okay, so you're saying that estrogen is obviously a huge factor in how we digest food and our metabolism in general, right? Estrogen is like the key factor.
I'd say, estrogen has far-reaching effects across all of our health because there's receptors all over our body. We also know it impacts how we process food. We know that it's an important stimulant of other, enzymes, of the enzymes that break down fat, for example, when we're eating fat. We know that it impacts insulin responses, etc. So because of how it impacts some of these enzymes and some of these other hormones, we know it impacts how we metabolize food.
Mm.
I would
Would
say
it
I would say it's a contributory factor.
Okay, because you hear about these stories about women and they say, "Oh, I'm going through menopause. I exercise every day. I haven't changed the way that I'm eating. I'm on point with everything. Nothing's changed, but I'm gaining weight." And
Yeah.
could the estrogen be basically a huge factor in that? Because if nothing else has changed and all the variables are the same, maybe it's the hormones.
Yeah, so one of the things that estrogen does, in really simple terms, is it directs fat away from our central part to our hips. So we often talk about women being a pear-shaped, i.e., the fat is around their hips and their bottom, and men have an apple shape, i.e., the fat is around their belly. Once you start to lose estrogen, you lose the effect that estrogen has in kind of directing fat to women's hips and bottoms. And what happens is the fat is directed more to the belly area once you lose that estrogen, which means that you're gaining what we call visceral adiposity, which is the bad kind of fat because it's around your tummy. We know fat around your tummy is more metabolically unhealthy. We know that it impacts lots of other areas related to health. So, firstly, by you're losing estrogen, going through the menopause, you change where your fat is deposited. So again, just like you said, you could be eating exactly the same, exercising the same, doing everything the same, but it's going to change where it is. You start to get that kind of fat around your belly. We also know that the estrogen will change, like I've said, how you metabolize that food. There's some evidence to show that estrogen may affect the hunger receptors in your brain. So you might not realize it, but you might actually be eating a little bit more because you're more hungry. And you hear lots of time anecdotally people saying, I'm eating exactly what I've always eaten. I'm doing exactly the same, but I'm just so hungry all the time. I mean, I'm perimenopausal and I'm certainly eating a lot more, not out of choice, but because I'm just so much more hungry. And so it affects so many different areas.
Yeah, I mean,
And
even
then,
losing sleep, right? Because if you lose sleep, then I would if I don't sleep well, I honestly eat more the next day for some reason.
yeah, so there's some great research showing that if you have a poor night's sleep, the next day the reward centers in your brain are heightened. And so when you've had a bad night's sleep, Bethany, these reward centers, whether you control it or not, will be saying, Bethany, you need a quick fix. Go and eat, I want you to give me this quick fix. Go and have these refined carbohydrates. Go and have these, unhealthy pastries. What also happens is, and we've published research on this ourselves, that if you have a poor night's sleep, you have a more unfavorable blood glucose response to your meals the next day, meaning you have bigger peaks and dips. And so if you're having bigger peaks and dips, if we think back to what I mentioned earlier about dips in blood sugar causing you to eat more throughout the day, causing you to feel more hungry. So you've got two things that are happening. Firstly, the sleep is driving you to eat more unhealthy food, the quick fix. Then it's causing you to have a worse blood sugar response that will drive you to eat more food. And then at the same time, you might be feeling really bloody grumpy because you're in, hormonal chaos, you're irritable, you don't feel like being physically active, you've got low
All the
mood, you've got
things.
all of these
Yeah.
other things. So it's like this perfect storm. And I think because of that, we have to be also a bit compassionate to ourselves that I think we can't underestimate how it impacts so much of how we are related to how we feel, how we look, how we, show up each day. That I think that we need to recognize, my God, it's affecting really every cell in my body, and it's tough.
Yeah. All right. So back to the whole menopause thing and the estrogen.
Yeah.
I know this is the $1 million question everyone is going to be asking. How do we avoid this? Is there like a little trick or magic pill or things that we can do to, let's just say someone's going through menopause and it's that person and they're doing all the right things and they're still gaining weight or is there something to help this?
So there is the option of HRT, so hormone replacement therapy. I'm not a medical doctor, and it's really important I give that caveat. What I can say is from our own research that we've published, we see that those taking HRT have lower blood pressure, lower visceral adiposity, so weight around the tummy, lower cholesterol, and obviously lower burden of symptoms. So they have lots lower irritability, sleep problems, etc., etc. So for those that want to take HRT, I think there's good evidence to show that it can improve all of these different or many of these different symptoms. It's variable just how responsive different women would be, and it's something that you'd need to have a discussion with your practitioner, your clinician. So really important to say, whilst our research shows the beneficial effects, as someone who's not clinically qualified or registered, I can't be advocating for it at an individual level. What we
Well,
do know from our own, yep.
no, I was just about to say, few weeks ago, I had a doctor, and she definitely recommended HRT for people going through menopause for that transition. And, there's the science to debunk all of the breast cancer myths and all of that. So to your point that she did recommend that.
Yeah, and I think, we've come a long way now in terms of our understanding of how HRT impacts our health, how it impacts our symptoms, when we should be starting HRT, what type of HRT we should be having. So in the UK now, the HRT that's prescribed is transdermal HRT, so it's either gel or patches, because we know that that is a lot safer than oral HRT. Oral HRT is metabolized in such a way that could increase your risk of certain clots, etc. So in the UK, transdermal is typically prescribed. We also know, based on more recent evidence, that the earlier it's prescribed, the better. So some of the problems with some of these old studies was starting HRT more than 10 years post someone becoming postmenopausal, at the age of 65, for example. And actually, if you can start it during the very early stages of perimenopause, that's where the evidence currently is pointing to there being more benefit. But what we do know is from our own Zoe Predict research is that diet can also help. And we recently completed a huge study where we looked at people's menopausal symptoms pre and post going on the Zoe program, which is a personalized nutrition program, which encourages many of the basic healthy eating principles. So a diversity of plant-based foods, minimizing ultra-processed foods, increasing your fiber intake, very kind of Mediterranean style diet, but in a really kind of personalized way delivered through our app. And what we found was that people who were following this or changed their diet, they had a 35% reduction on average in their symptoms just by changing their diet. Now, they might have changed some other aspects of their lifestyle as well. So it might have been that it also improved their sleep, and that all had knock-on effects. But I think that's really encouraging. And it actually is in line with some other research that looked at randomly allocating people to either follow a Mediterranean diet or a very typical US Western style diet, as we call it. And they found also significant reductions in symptom burden for those following a Mediterranean diet. Now, that's following an overall healthy dietary pattern. And then you can drill it down to look at, well, are there specific foods? Are there specific nutrients? There's loads of studies out there looking at individual supplements, that you get on in the market. And I think this is where we need to be a bit more cautious, that generally following an overall healthy diet, we've seen from our research and others, yes, it can improve symptoms. But apart from soy isoflavones, I think there's very limited evidence on the benefit of supplements. However, having said that, if it works for you and it's helping your symptoms and you can afford the supplements and they're not giving you any other side effects, then go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the term is, you can't out supplement a good diet. So, or a bad diet, excuse me. You can't out supplement a bad diet. Now, real quick, anyone going through menopause, is there anything that they should avoid, like coffee, for example, or anything that would actually make symptoms worse?
So I would always start from a place of what we can add in to make things better. But I think, and that will naturally displace things that we know might be worse for us. So we know having heavily processed foods, really high in sugar, for example, are not going to help our symptoms. We also know that it's a time that we're at increased risk of cardiovascular disease. And so therefore we need to be really mindful of factors that are risk factors for this. So thinking about reducing our saturated fat intake, for example, reducing our processed red meat intake, and those kinds of foods that we know increase our risk of cardiovascular disease. I would never say there's a single food that's like, absolutely, we should stop. One drink I think we need to be quite mindful of is alcohol. So we process alcohol differently. And most, again, if you speak to any peri or postmenopausal women, most of them will say, oh my gosh, I used to be able to have 2-3 glasses of wine. Now I have one and I feel awful the next day. And we know that's going to exacerbate symptoms. It's going to make you feel worse. So I think being really mindful about how much alcohol you're having is the real key thing that I would really watch out for.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I was just thinking about coffee, for example, because like when I was younger, I mean, I'm 35 now, but I'll have like 1 cup in the morning, but I could have like 3 cups and feel fine. Like I wasn't even wired. Now, like 1 cup, it's good, but that's it. So yeah, I'm just curious, if that does a dip or a spike in anything.
Yeah, I don't know, in relation to caffeine, particularly in relation to peri and postmenopause. So yeah, that would be interesting. There might be some studies out there. I'd be interested actually after this to have a look.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just amazed in general of like, I think back of what we used to eat when, we were kids and teenagers and like, it was like nothing, like it didn't affect us. And maybe I'm sure it did, but just not how it does today.
Oh, absolutely. I think about I have, since starting the perimenopause transition a couple of years ago, I am eating the healthiest I've ever eaten because for the first time ever, I'm seeing how food's impacting me. I feel worse when I have the unhealthy food. I feel terrible if I have more than my couple of glasses of wine,
For
when I
sure.
go out, etc. So I'm feeling it. Now, in a way, perhaps that's a good thing because it's actually prompted me to make some changes. But yeah, in an ideal world, we'd all like to get away with being able to eat whatever we want. But, in the long term, it catches up with us as well.
Right, right. Well, Dr. Sarah, I mean, you have brought so much knowledge to such a short amount of time in this interview. Where can people find you to dig deeper? I know you're on another podcast as well. So give us all that information.
Yeah, thank you. So we have our own Zoe Science Nutrition podcast. You can go to any podcast platform, YouTube, etc., and find it. It's called Zoe Science Nutrition. I'm on that regularly. We also have lots of information on our Zoe web pages. So you can go to zoe.com and you can find out lots about the kind of research we're doing. You can also look at the different projects that we're running, etc. I'm also on Instagram, so you can go to, I think it's Dr. Sarah Berry, I think, at Instagram.
Well, I'll be sure to put
And
we'll put all those links in today's show notes so people can
great.
find you on Instagram, your website, the podcast, and all that good stuff, and they can just find you with one easy tap.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Digest This. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review in your podcast app to let us know. If you're ever wondering how you can support me and this podcast, sharing it with your friends and family is the best way. This is a Wellness Loud production produced by Drake Peterson and edited by Mike Fry. To check out more shows by my team, go to wellnessloud.com, and to email the show, message us at digestthispod@gmail.com. See you next time. The content of this show is for educational and informational purposes only. It is not a substitute for individual medical and mental health advice and does not constitute a provider-patient relationship. As always, talk to your doctor or health team first.